successful negotiation that led to the release of Theo Padnos, who was held by Nusra in Syria, who's a journalist and an author. And in between Aretae and Theo is Chris Mellon, who's a researcher here, who, thanks to the James Foley Foundation and Hostage US, led the report which looked at the question of does a no concession policy, how helpful is that or not. Diane Foley, who of course, runs the James Foley Foundation, and finally Rachel Briggs of Hostage US. So everybody's going to talk for, make some opening remarks of up to 5 minutes, and then we'll open up to a conversation between all of us. So, should I start with you?
So I came to this work in a very unusual way. I was then the chief of staff to David Bradley, who is the owner of a media company that publishes The Atlantic magazine. And I also was the general counsel. And I literally was just in my office one day when David popped by and said, hey, could you come join me to help me with a small project? And I came to his office, and he then told me the story of how he had worked to find a freelancer of ours that had gone missing in Libya 2 years earlier, and how through that effort he had gotten to know the family of a wonderful young journalist named James Foley, and how Jim was missing in Syria and believed at the time to have been held with the regime. And he asked me if I might be willing to help him with a little bit of research to try to figure out who might know someone who might know someone in the regime who might be able to influence Jim's release. And so I said, sure, that doesn't sound too difficult, just a little bit of research. Well, of course, it turned out that Jim wasn't held with the regime, and over the course of the many months that followed, we did a lot more than research, and we got to know the wonderful Foley family, and through them, the families of a number of other Americans who were held in Syria, and sort of went with them on their journey as they tried to find their children. And in the end, we got to know Theo, who came home, and we mourned with the families of the Americans that were killed by ISIS in 2014. So that's my involvement, but did not come to this through any sort of normal channel.
Chris.
Do you want to come back to me? Because I have some comments basically about our research.
Okay. I thought, let's see. Yes, I want to take a quick look at where we are now, morally speaking, with our American hostage policy. But before I say what I have to say, I want you to know that I mean to speak now about our hostage policy as regards people kidnapped by Islamic groups in the Middle East. I realize that the taking of hostages is a wider phenomenon, but I don't really see what purpose is served by having a universal policy that fits the entire globe, because each region is so different. In my view, it makes sense to have a Middle East specific set of guidelines. So this is what I intend to speak about now. Where we are with our policy is that, is my microphone screwing up? People can hear me okay?
I think if you speak directly into it, it's going to feedback.
I see. So
normally.
I should sit up like my mom tells me. Okay. Where we are with our policy is that long ago, some very dumb dummies in the U.S. government, I assume somewhere here in Washington, determined that Americans will be endangered less if we make no concessions to hostage takers. Our officials now cling to this dumbness even when they know American men and women have been undergoing tortures, in some cases for years. And even when they know that female hostages are being raped, they cling to this stupidity. Because of this dumbness, we have lost 4 beautiful, promising, courageous young people who represent the best in us. Just for the record, just so everybody knows, Americans are in danger in the Middle East, not because we have monetary value, which we do, and everybody there knows that, and not even because there are a few wicked terrorists running around over there, which there are, but because our government keeps bombing Muslim countries over and over. Their civilians over there are unhappy about this situation. Each person, of course, over there is unhappy in his own way, and some people are very little bothered by our bombing. But to speak in general terms for a moment, we here are in danger when we go over there because the guy who runs the internet cafe, or the guy who drives the taxi, or shares a cup of tea with you at a tea truck in the street, feels he has issues with the drones and the fighter bombers and the tomahawks and the rendition programs and the penal colonies that our government organizes. So he feels that you, if you go over there and have tea in the street with them, might have a connection to these things that are circulating in the sky. So he feels it's appropriate to investigate. This is what happened to me. I think it's what happened to many other people. So now things over there have developed to the point at which this civilian population over there believes in 1,000 further horrible crimes against Muslim civilians that our government is committing. Many of these things are like more nightmares than actual facts. It doesn't matter. So why not investigate? The moment you hear this word investigate in Syria, it's too late. They've got you, and you're in trouble. So in my prisons, for the relatively low-ranking fighters I saw from day to day, I was a high-value prisoner. Everybody I saw for 2 years with Jabhat al-Nusra, very high-value prisoner, not because of the monetary value, but because these guys don't want to be rich. They want to fight the jihad. I had high value because revenge is important to them. I had high value because setting things right is important to them, and they felt they could do that, basically by abusing me. They often told me they could not revenge themselves against the entirety of the American government, but when they found a representative of the American government, as they sometimes tried to believe me to be, they could not altogether keep themselves from expressing their feelings. Their wish for me to be a walking, talking embodiment of the thing they hate is very important and relevant to this discussion. They require a plausible representative of the thing that is droning Muslims across the Middle East, but they're very flexible and liberal people when it comes to plausibility. And this is the nature of the threat that we face. And they can look at you and they don't have to ask too many questions to know that you work for the CIA. So anyone with the remotest connection to America, and sometimes people with no connection to America, can serve this purpose. When they find such a being, and anyone in this room would satisfy the requirements, they are overjoyed, as they were when they got me. And not because they see dollar signs, rather because they feel bombed and invaded. They feel their sacred things are under assault. Now, looking back, it seems to me that now that I understand the context, this feeling of being under assault and invasion, which comes from having drones in the air and having airplanes in the air and being bombed so frequently. Looking back, understanding this context better, I think that many of those Jabhat al-Nusra fighters went easy on me. And for this, I thank them. Thank you, Jabhat al-Nusra. By the way, you can thank them yourselves because they're on Twitter all day. They really will not. They love Twitter. Twitter is their favorite thing. Anyway, all right, the last thing I want to say is that if we really wanted to make things better, we would develop a sensible policy in the Middle East which would recognize that we put our own citizens in danger when we attack those countries. And we better have a really good reason and be and have more confidence in the technology to kill the people we mean to kill. And even if we do kill those people, they have so many more people to take the places of the guys that we kill. I really don't see what purpose is served by dropping the bombs and sending the drones and the rendition programs, which hopefully we've stopped. The torture, I don't see what purpose is served because it's going to come back to us. Those are my feelings. Mm-hmm.
Appreciate that. I want to thank the New America Foundation and Hostage US in a big way for this opportunity. I really feel as an American that it is very important that we look at our American hostage policy to make sure it truly protects us. During Jim's captivity, I was repeatedly told this policy keeps us safe. But after Jim was held for 2 years and then brutally murdered, I really began to have some doubts and yet realized that it may just be our individual case and that we really need research to see what the facts are. So I'm very grateful to the New America Foundation and Hostage US for undertaking this research. But what concerns me about the results are concerning, because what it seems to find is that American and British citizens are being kidnapped just as often as those of our Western allies. And the outcomes for us and the British are awful. I mean, they're being killed in many cases. So that is very concerning to me. Why are our allies more successful in bringing their citizens home? I feel that our current hostage policy really tied the hands of the FBI and State Department during Jim's captivity. They weren't allowed to directly engage with the terrorist, the group labeled terrorist, which left us alone as a family to figure out how to negotiate Jim's release. The threat of prosecution of anyone assisting us to help raise a ransom prohibits most families from even being able to attempt it. We didn't want any of our generous friends to be prosecuted for helping get Jim home. And I really feel for the average American family, unless you're unbelievably wealthy, that would be the case, you know. It certainly prevented us. I'm concerned that the researching about kidnapping of our citizens is very difficult because international corporations that travel and work worldwide, security firms, and governments are very reluctant to share their data. I feel this is understandable because of concerns about harm for hostages and the success of quiet negotiation, but it truly constrains research because it doesn't give us real numbers to ensure that our policy is the best. This research we have today is the best we could do. We could glean from cases that are public and from people willing to share data, but we realize that it may be incomplete. And that's concerning too, because we don't want to extrapolate that it's not protecting Americans, if in fact it is, but it's just that what this data shows is that it is not. So I guess one of the things is I call on all of us to look for ways to confidentially share such data so that we can in fact ensure that our policy works, that it really protects Americans when they're working or traveling internationally. And let us never forget this day that Austin Tice, Bob Levinson, Caitlin Coleman, Paul Larson, and hundreds of nameless Americans are held hostage, hoping to be freed. Thank you.
Thanks for the opportunity. I just wanted to start with three basic comments about the challenge relating to hostage policy right now. The first is a very kind of basic truth, which is that to evaluate anything you need evidence. You don't evaluate based on gut instinct or a hunch. You can only evaluate based on evidence. And this is why the data here is completely non-negotiable. We need data to be able to say categorically whether one approach is more effective than a second, a third, or a fourth approach. And as Diane so eloquently said, the challenge we have here in the hostage space is not just that this is data which at a certain point in time needs to be kept secret. I would argue that it doesn't need to be kept secret after the event. I don't think there's a national security imperative for that. But necessarily there is an element of secrecy that is required at some point in that data process. But also because this is data that is held by multiple actors. There are different types of hostage cases, as Theo said. There are political and terrorist cases where the data will almost exclusively sit within government. There are criminal and financially motivated cases where that data will be sitting with individual families. It sits with private sector crisis response companies. And there is no sharing of that data. there is no pooling of that data. And I would entirely agree with Diane that it is absolutely vital that we find some way to bring together the data, to share the data, to clean up the data, and to create the resource that can then allow for proper, smart analysis on an evidence-based way of the relative merits and success of different policies in different circumstances. And it's not good enough to say, as long as that is known by somebody in a secret place, as long as they know what they're doing, it's all okay. Because like all policy, you know, we make improvements through scrutiny. And we make improvements by opening things up and having people look at it from a fresh perspective. And so the need to constantly reassess, are we still doing the right thing? Does the thing we've been doing for 20 years still work? Do we need to adapt it? Is it still okay? You can only do that when it's open to scrutiny, which is why I think things like the New America Foundation Research Initiative are really important. The second point I wanted to make, though, is that it's also vitally important that families have access to this knowledge and this expertise. Because families are necessarily and should be centrally involved in that operational response. Of the many, many, many hundreds of families that I've worked with over 15 years in this space, supporting them, providing access to information and the full range of our services, you know, I know for a fact that one of the first questions that they tend to be asked is, would you authorize a military raid, for example? I mean, how on earth do you answer that question? I mean, put aside for one moment the fact that your loved one's life is at stake. How do you start to figure out, how do I answer that question? Now, if I was in that position, I'd want to know, okay, so in what proportion of cases is a military raid used? In what proportion of those cases is it successful or not successful? I would want the data so that I could make that decision for my loved one whose life may depend on it from a position of information and knowledge as opposed to kind of guesswork, really. So it's really important that families get access to that information, and it's really important that they are a central part of that strategy, making choices along the way, coming alongside government as partners. And it's in that view that I really do have to pay enormous credit to the substantial distance that the US government has moved over the last 2 years. I personally have been supporting US families over a number of years, and I can tell you the response that we see from government today is a world away from the response that I saw on occasions previously. So credit where credit is due, absolutely. But I think families we will still always be asking for more for families going through this dreadful, dreadful, horrific experience. And then the third and final point I wanted to make, just as a matter of introduction, as we're looking at the issue of hostage policy, of course our minds always go to the most critical and the most important question, which is, how do we get that person home safely to their family as quickly as possible? Of course that's where our focus always goes first. But let us not forget that this is a human crime. And actually it's the humanness of this crime which makes it so effective. You know, taking a loved one away from their family creates a set of pressures unlike any others in policy terms. And this is a deeply human crime, and it has an impact on the human beings who are affected by it, not just those poor individuals who find themselves incarcerated with bad people in many different parts of the world, but also their families at home who need the kind of support that we provide to get them through it, and then also that person coming home so that when they get home they can do what one of our board members, Jessica Buchanan, talks about, which is surviving survival, because that's just when another set of challenges arises. And so I think it's always really important when thinking about hostage policy to think about the totality of it and that human care dimension, which really is so fundamental to this particular crime.
Well, I'm glad I deferred because I think there's some really good points raised there, particularly some caveats about the data and about the research we've been able to do. And I want to emphasize again that what we really want is to have a more complete data set and also not to be relying on open source data. We have great confidence in the analysis that we did do on the basis of the information that we had, but this is an issue where virtually every party is actively trying to obfuscate the truth, and that is a big problem. Other people have reached similar conclusions to ours, notably West Point and Rand, but I don't think that anyone has definitively proven any of the conclusions that I'm about to share in sort of a quick digest from our research. So without further ado or further caveats, I'm just going to share that with you. I hope that many of you have read the paper. For those of you who have not, these in short are our conclusions. And I hope this will be a valuable context for the following discussion on policy. So our research produced two primary conclusions, the first being that hostages...
Can you tell us what the sample size was and
yeah.
a little bit of detail about that so people understand what it is?
Right, so we originally got this data from Hostage US. It was compiled from a number of other databases that also compiled from open sources, so the Global Terrorism Database at the University of Maryland's START program, the Aid Worker Security Database, and the Combating Terrorism Center database at West Point, as well as, I think, independent work by researchers of Hostage US, going back and looking through newspaper reports to add to it. The end result was that once we had cut it down to cases where the hostage takers were from a designated foreign terrorist organization, from a militant organization, or a Somali pirate group, we had about just under 1,200 cases. So that was our sample size. And that
from, what was the cutoff point?
Since 9/11. Since 9/11 and from the West. And if you can see our report to check up on who we included in the West. For a variety of reasons, we cut out certain members of the OECD. But we had hostages from 32 different countries in that sample. And we were interested in looking at a couple of things. We were interested in looking at outcomes and trying to connect outcomes to policy. And we were interested in looking at trends over time, looking at particularly whether ransom payments encouraged future kidnappings, a variety of other things, which I'll give some attention to now. But our first conclusion was that hostages from countries that do not make concessions, which for our purposes will primarily be ransoms. Those at least are among the two types of concessions that you are likely to find in open source material, the other being a prisoner exchange. People from those countries experience far worse outcomes than hostages from countries that do make concessions and pay ransoms. For our purposes, we're talking primarily about the United States and the United Kingdom, who had large sample sizes, big enough for us to compare to some of the European countries that do pay ransoms. So our analysis in terms of differentiating between different policy groups largely combined the United States and the United Kingdom versus continental Europe or the EU, notably Germany, France, Italy, Spain, who had the largest samples from that group. And the second major conclusion was we found no evidence that citizens from countries that don't make concessions were protected by that policy. In other words, we didn't see a relationship between making concessions and your citizens being targeted or kidnapped in disproportionate numbers. But we did see that once people had been abducted, there was a very clear difference in terms of outcomes. The US and the UK, we had, I think, 90 hostages in total who were deliberately killed by their captors, who were murdered. 41 of them were American and 15 were British, which is 45% and 15% respectively of the entire sample. So 60%, the majority, from those two countries alone. And we concluded further that the no concessions policy didn't effectively deter hostage takers from kidnapping American and British citizens. And we think that's largely due to the fact that it's inherently a somewhat disorganized activity, and hostage takers tend to be opportunistic. They're limited by the people who are present in the region in which they can operate. They're also limited by security concerns. A diplomat is hard to get your hands on. An aid worker, much easier. A freelance journalist, much easier. So in fact, they have kind of a limited number of people from whom to choose. And we don't deny that there are obvious cases where hostage takers do want to take a hostage of a certain nationality. But what we see is a disconnect between some individual examples where that may be the case and the data in the aggregate. So there are a number of sort of confounding factors along the way that we feel prevent that, that desire from manifesting in the data at large. In other words, if hostage takers could choose at will from people of any nationality, I have no doubt that they would discriminate on that basis. But for practical reasons, they're not able to do that often enough, successfully enough, that we see any real correlation in our data. And the other major policy consideration here that remains is that hostage taking does play an enormous role in financing terrorist groups around the world. And you also see in cases like the rise of Al-Qaeda in North Africa, out of essentially a criminal trafficking group with some jihadist ties, that ransom payments can create a pervasive kidnapping risk in an area that applies to any Westerners who may be present. Which brings us to sort of the core policy challenge that we see for the US, which is that you have to craft a national policy to address a fundamentally international problem. In other words, the no concessions policy aims to control variables that are not really ours alone to control. Especially if concessions made by other Western countries increase the risk of kidnapping for Americans abroad, as well as the citizens of the countries who are paying ransoms, then there's really no unilateral policy that's going to address that risk for the United States. And we have persuaded a lot of our allies in the G8 and the EU to commit publicly to not making concessions and not making ransom payments. But the fact is that they haven't abided by those agreements. They continue to pay, and we're unlikely to persuade them to stop, partly because they don't have the military resources to recover their hostages by other means in most cases, and also because they have a different set of political pressures that make it harder for them to leave hostages in the hands of the kidnappers or to leave them to die compared to the United States. There's just a different level of public pressure on governments. So the combined result of these two policies, we feel, over that period from 2001 to the present, is that lots of Americans and Brits have been killed, while at the same time these hostage-taking groups have been able to rake in hundreds of millions of dollars. Al-Qaeda in particular, ISIS as well. And that doesn't seem to us to be sustainable. It seems like the US is getting really the raw end of that deal. And it's questionable whether that has succeeded in terms of protecting American or British citizens, or in terms of denying a lot of money to these groups who are being paid handsomely by other governments, particularly when there are alternative outlets for value for an American or a British hostage, which may take the form of a propaganda video to aid in recruiting or put pressure on a foreign government. It may also include using the death of a hostage to influence the sum that they're going to get for a European who's going to be ransomed. And I do want to stop and acknowledge the 2015 policy reforms that the Obama administration carried out, which, like Rachel said, I think are a really significant step in the right direction. Not only because they've modified and slightly loosened the no concessions policy by removing the threat of prosecution from certain private parties that pay to designated foreign terrorist organizations, but also for creating the Hostage Recovery Fusion Cell to improve relations with the families of hostages, to improve response times, improve negotiations, which are all also really important variables in determining outcomes, beyond just the policy around concessions. And so the last thing I would emphasize is that I think where this leaves us is we're trying to address the international hostage taking as essentially an economic problem. To look at it, I would like to see us have the data to look at it as a market so we can apply price controls, so we can prevent certain European governments from inflating ransom prices by overpaying, and so that various Western governments are not competing amongst themselves without sharing information to recover their own hostages and sort of bidding against one another. There's various really bad dynamics to this that don't, result in a good outcome for anyone. And yeah, so my hope is that if parties can be persuaded this is in their mutual interest, if the United States can take a more understanding and flexible tone with its allies, I hope that'll be a possibility.
One quick question, which Rachel raised, which I think you know the answer to, Chris, which is, what is the outcome for hostages who are rescued, where a military rescue takes place? I mean, if you were to say, to answer Rachel's question, advising a family, what does the data say about the likelihood that things are going to go right or wrong?
Well, I'm really glad you asked that question in particular, because we have an answer, and it's an answer that's been arrived at by a number of other groups doing the same calculations on the basis of open source information, which is that it's fatal to the hostage about 20% of the time. But we also have some sort of anomalous stuff in our data that comes from the same sources, particularly relating to Germany and their success with rescues. So they have the highest percentage of all hostages rescued of any country in our database. It's about 20% of all of their hostages, I think 133. I just say 20% of 133, not 133 rescues. And a lot of them, firstly, none is reported as having been conducted by German special forces or police hostage rescue units. They're always reported as having been conducted by the local special forces of Chad or Nigeria or wherever the hostage may be held, and there are no fatalities amongst that group. Now that is suspicious to me, for obvious reasons. That's a flaw with open source data collection, where if we had the true information, we might find that the actual rate of fatality for rescues is higher than 20%, maybe it's 30%. We don't know. So that's not, I couldn't give someone an answer with any confidence.
But still, if I'm a family member and I know there's a 1 in 5 chance that my family member is going to be killed in a rescue, that's a pretty useful piece of information, because I think most people would presume, based on watching a lot of movies, that this is going to go flawlessly, and that's not an issue.
Yeah, and a lot of those unsuccessful ones are also with the best special forces in the world. I mean, that's not amateur operations.
So Rachel used an interesting term, surviving survival. So Theo, how have you managed that?
Let's see. I didn't. They almost killed me. But mentally they didn't. Physically they damaged me, but mentally they didn't damage me. I understood what they're trying to do mentally. I mean, there's a. During the course of this whole thing, they wanted me to have certain beliefs and to believe things about them, which I did. For instance, that they are an inscrutable, indomitable power that, can be very, very cruel and wicked and terrifying. They wanted me to believe that. I did. I really, in the depths of my soul, I did. But now I know that they're not. I know that they are scrutable. And now I know that they're not indomitable. So as soon as I was out, I was cured and happy. The release was the cure for the disease. I did not need to see any shrink. I did see a shrink, but I was telling him these stories, and I'm like, shrink, you should be paying me. So I didn't feel that they damaged me psychologically. They themselves are damaged psychologically. Maybe we should. No, you can't fix them psychologically. No, I didn't feel that I was really. I survived physically, and for that I'm very grateful. That had nothing to do with me. Thank you, Aretae, maybe. Something more to do with that. then I didn't have anything to do with the physical survival, just because they didn't kill me. However, psychologically, they didn't really hurt me, so I didn't really feel wounded, so I didn't have anything to survive.
So Aretae, I mean, to the extent that you can, because obviously some of this is not public, but explain what was the Atlantic's role in getting Theo out?
So I think knowing that money was not going to be an option, one of the things that we did with Theo's cousins and his mom is we all sort of sat around together and said, okay, what could possibly influence the group that has him to let him go? Who can possibly bring influence to bear? And obviously, we aren't a government, and so there's a lot of things that we weren't able to offer. But we sort of created a network map of who has relationships with Jabhat al-Nusra and who's supporting them, and what might we be able to find out about what they need through research and through contact with people on the ground. And eventually it became clear that that one of the supporters of a lot of rebel groups, including Jabhat al-Nusra, was the government of Qatar. And we then sort of said, okay, well, who do we know that might know someone there? And we eventually found a contact with the foreign minister. And David got to know the foreign minister, and I think Samantha Power separately also introduced Theo's mom to someone who had a relationship with the emir. And so those two channels in parallel eventually led to Qatar taking a strong interest in Theo's case and becoming very interested in doing something. I mean, what they said is that it was sort of altruism, that they wanted to do it for Theo's mom, and you know, it may be more that they wanted to you know, have a good relationship with the United States and sort of be seen as having done something good for an American citizen. But regardless of what the reason was, whether it was for Theo's mom or for a different reason, they intervened. And it's not known whether they paid money. They've insisted that they did not, and the U.S. government says that they did not. But whatever influence they had to bear, they brought in Theo's case. And I think so often in these cases when we worked on them, where the rubber hit the road was that we couldn't figure out what these groups really wanted, and we could not necessarily figure out what we as private citizens could give them that would cause them to give up what they regarded as a huge piece of leverage. So I think that if I had to sort of say what the lesson is in this case, if I were a family looking at this anew, it would be starting from day one, figure out what is it that this group could possibly want, and then figure out every possible means that you could to give them what they want, whether it's through government action or private.
We have a very clear case right now where 5 Americans are being held by the Haqqani network, and it's very clear what the Haqqanis want, which is one of their family members has been held by the Afghan government, Anas Haqqani, who's a sort of relatively low-level player on the Haqqani network who's on death row. You know, that a prisoner exchange, as we know, in fact, that can work. So Rachel, how do you assess that potential, that case?
Yeah,
I
should preface by saying that as an organisation, we don't talk about specific cases, and you know, whether we're working with the family or not, just because of our position and our. I mean, it's, you know, families finding themselves in that kind of position, and let's not forget that those cases are very, very long running, and we were talking multiple years. And you know, the point at which we come in with families is kind of getting them through it, and you know, spare a thought for those folks who are years and years and years into a situation like that, and are, you know, years in wondering, well, what is the solution here? And for a family going through this, you know, the great frustration is, you know, Aretae talked about, you know, what influence can we bear? Who wants what, and what can we do? You know, the desperate thing for families is that in a case like that, there's kind of almost nothing that you as the family can do, because this is in the hands of governments, or this is in the hands of a kind of an international negotiation process. And so listen, I don't have the answer to those cases, but I can tell you that in particular, those long-running cases, you know, really take their toll on the family, and it's a desperately difficult situation to find yourself in.
And of course, the family often knows very, very little. I mean, did your family know much about Yemen or Iraq or Syria, the places that you were reporting from? And so, I mean, typically, the families got very little knowledge about the actual place where this is happening and the politics and there's.
Although I have to say, if I was working in the State Department, I would make job offers to any family coming out of this situation, because I can tell you there's family members that I'm supporting, and it wouldn't surprise me if they've learned 3 different languages so they can follow the Twitter accounts of every last person, even 6 degrees of separation from the people that they think are holding their family members. I mean, the level of expertise, I remember going back 20 years to my own experience of having somebody taken in, a family member taken in Colombia, and overnight you become the world's expert on Colombia, because that knowledge is what could potentially stand between you and your loved one coming home again. So it's a really steep learning curve, and I know organisations like, you know, New America, who have tremendous expertise within them, are a potential fantastic resource for families as well, to quickly have half an hour with you, Peter, on, you know, the situation in Afghanistan can increase your level of knowledge from 0 to actually a pretty good standard.
Let's open it up for questions. Mr. Foley.
My one question is, John Foley, Jimstat. My one question is, what is the difference between the European countries and our country? Why are they willing and able to negotiate and make payments, in fact, if they are made, and we are not? What difference? Why are 4 Americans dead and 15, or roughly 15 Europeans home? And I would like to know what policy issues come to bear there. They live in the same world that we live in. They are aware of the money's going to be used for bad things, but they seem, on paper, or to want their citizens home at any price. Thank you.
I mean, I'm not a member of the U.S. government, so I can't really explain that totally. But I mean, and Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think this started with the Nixon administration as a policy, and I think it's one of those policies that, you know, on the face of it, seems to make a lot of sense, which is certainly we don't want to be funding terrorist organizations, and secondarily, you know, if we make concessions, then we're encouraging other kidnappings. I think the value of the research that we've done, which you know, is openly out there and anybody can criticize it, is that is a presumption. That is not a, you know, it doesn't. It's a presumption that doesn't seem to be backed by the evidence. Now, you could make the caveat that, well, some Americans have just been killed for political reasons, and it doesn't matter if we had a no concession policy. And I think that's a very reasonable caveat, but it's something that's very hard to sort of disentangle the question of Americans as political targets as opposed to just targets of convenience who are being kidnapped, and how that affects the outcome. Chris, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I would say it's not, I don't think it's entirely a question of policy. I think it's partially a question of values. And I think that Americans have a different attitude towards accepting risk and personal responsibility, and also a different idea about what their government is expected to do for them. Such that in Europe, when someone is taken hostage, there is more public outcry, there is more pressure on the government. It becomes a political crisis in a way that it doesn't seem to in this country. And it may also be, you know, there might be another contributing factor, which is that maybe some of these, if you're the government of Italy, you don't worry as much about making a ransom payment to Al-Qaeda if it's not quite going to be your mess to clean up in the same way that it would be for the United States. That's speculation, but.
So then the solution would be political, and not emotional political, so that obviously if I don't care if my brother's brought home, there's no reason for change the plan, because it's not happening.
I think that's, yeah, I think that's true also in terms of trying to create a unified policy. I mean, I don't think that the Italians or the Germans or anyone else want to be paying the sorts of sums that they are, but you know.
I think in examining the data, one thing that would be interesting to look at would be whether different administrations have applied the no concessions policy differently, such that there are different results within different periods of time. Because one of the things that we heard very anecdotally is that the Bush administration took a different position about what no concessions really meant. And while the US government was not willing to pay ransoms under the Bush administration, one of the things we've heard, and I don't know whether this is absolutely true, but one of the things we've heard is that there was more willingness on their part to work with other countries so that other countries or other parties could achieve things that the United States government couldn't itself.
Yeah, I've heard that, but probably from the same anecdotal sources, so I can't necessarily substantiate that.
Thank you. Joseph Salaf from the ANN Group. Question for the gentleman who was talking about the numbers, and maybe I misheard. 35 Americans have been taken hostage and killed?
41.
41. Since when?
Since 2001, as of the publication of the paper in January of this year. Yeah.
Across the world.
Mm-hmm.
And the number you gave on the Germans was 135?
Well, to be clear, the number 41 was the number of Americans who were murdered. The actual number in our sample during that period of Americans in total was 225.
What's the difference between murdered?
Well, many of the other 225 survived. Yeah.
What's the question?
No, the question was just simply, I was trying to check the numbers because the number was large to me to hear 41. I had heard 35, and now you're saying 130. The question was how many Germans, because you were talking earlier about how many Germans had been taken.
Oh, had been rescued out of a total sample for Germany of 133 in that period, versus I think 225 Americans in that period. Now, you have to check the paper. I don't have all of the numbers at my immediate command, but yeah.
Lady here.
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Danielle Gilbert. I'm a PhD candidate at GW, and I'm writing my dissertation about hostage taking. So first of all, thank you so much for putting this together. Theo and Diane, it is so meaningful to see you here and to hear from you. I cannot even express in words. Having read your stories over the past several years, and to see you here in person really means a lot. So thank you for sharing your stories with us. I can second what everyone is saying up there about the difficulty in the data. So amen to that. It's really, really frustrating and difficult for policy. To my question, I'm sorry, I could ask you so many things, but quickly to Rachel, how do we square US hostage policy that we've had previously? I know it's been lifted since 2015, the review, but discussions about prosecution of family members. How do we square that with K&R insurance and the fact that those kinds of ransom payments have gone through for a long time?
Yeah. Well, let me just reiterate a little bit about the fact that we're talking about different types of crime here, essentially. So I think somebody made the point earlier that this is a big old world, and there's lots of different types of people who are using the practice of taking somebody against their will and holding them for a period of time. There's lots of different people doing that for different reasons and for different outcomes. And so to answer your question by detour of sort of going back to the question of numbers, our estimates, which are estimates, are that there are at least a couple of hundred Americans a year taken overseas. Now, most people's jaws would hit the ground hearing that number, because of course we hear about a tiny, tiny fraction of them. And that's because we mostly hear about the cases which go public, of course, and they are mostly the terrorist-related cases. But the majority of cases are criminal and are solved financially. And you are usually an engineer in South America, or you're a banker in Mexico City, or you're a tourist in Kenya who gets snatched and taken into Somalia. Very broad range of people. And I think one of the challenges in this area of policy is this challenge of making, as somebody said, we have a national policy for what is an international problem, it's international problems, plural actually, and the way in which you go about solving the problem in relation to short-term hostage cases in Mexico City that might last a few days or a few weeks and involve a straightforward payment, usually quite a high degree of, potentially a high degree of violence to force the payment quickly. The kind of response you need for that is different entirely to the kind of response that you need for a very long-term terrorist kidnap, where really there are only a very narrow number of options on the table and they're all within the gift of government. So I hope that partly answers your question. And I also just wanted to applaud you for doing research in this area, because, you know, going back to where I started, you know, we desperately need scrutiny. Scrutiny is a good thing in policy terms. Scrutiny is a good thing in most areas of life, apart from my karaoke singing. But it's a good thing in most areas of life. And, you know, having master's students like you take this on, chip away at the sorry, did I demote you? Oh my goodness. Blame it on me being a foreigner. We're terrible. It is really desperately important. And so, you know, we as an organisation always try to do whatever we can to support that, because knowledge is power in this area and knowledge is better outcomes, I hope. So thank you for your work as well.
Kevin Barron from Defence One. Wait for the mic.
I'm Kevin Barron. I'm the executive editor of Defense One. For disclosure, we are one of the Atlantic Media properties, so David Bradley is the owner of our publication and my boss. I also worked for Stars and Stripes when Jim was at Stripes here in DC, and he was out overseas. My question is on the military options. You mentioned with Germany the success of military action and the frequency. Can you tell me a little bit more about just specifically the American success rates, what's changed in the last couple of years, and what are the hindrances, especially when it seems in some of these higher profile cases, the U.S. military government knew where some of the hostages were, often at different times, and either did not act or acted too late about the difficulties of getting to that decision to send in a force to try to rescue.
Well, I want to reiterate firstly that on the subject of Germany and their rescues, you know, when I first ran the numbers, I thought they must really know what they're doing, right? And upon closer scrutiny, I'm skeptical that that's in fact what's happening. And most of these European governments do actively try to obscure the fact that they're usually making ransom payments or otherwise negotiating for the release of hostages. So I would not necessarily look at them as sort of the paradigm for success. Speaking about sort of the operational considerations, on the US side, it's not something I've looked at in great detail. And it's certainly not something that I'm an expert on. What I have been noticing is that more recently there are jihadist groups that are taking countermeasures, a very simple countermeasure to the possibility of a raid, which is simply to station people by the hostages to kill them if they hear helicopters or gunshots or whatever the case may be. That has only happened, you know, a limited number of times, so it's not really appropriate for me to discuss it in terms of like historical trends, but that seems to be on the increase, and I don't know what the strategic or tactical, you know, way around that is.
Like Chris, isn't it the fact that the two countries that are most likely to mount a military operation are the Americans and the British, because they have the greatest capacity, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And then so the 20% outcomes for where the hostage ends up dead, it's I'm sure you can talk to Kevin offline, but these are largely American and British operations that are doing. Most European countries don't have the capacity to mount a successful rescue job.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay, Tara Maller.
No, I just wanted to comment that I think you're asking a very good question. In the case of Jim, our government knew where Jim was for a good 9 months, pretty much, and we had very good data about exactly where they were, and that's why I think this research is so important, because there obviously were reasons that our government was constrained from actually going in and getting the 4 Americans. They knew there were 4 Americans there, and particularly as the French and the Spanish came out successfully, we were able, and the Italian, we were able to very in a very pinpointed way. I believe our military was very ready to go do it. But there were reasons politically and, that the administration really felt they could not. We have a lot of assumptions. We wonder if one of them was that all of these countries had hostages together. There were actually, it's unusual that, well, I don't know if it's unusual, but this case, there were, all of our allies were there. We had British and French and German and Danish, Italian, Spanish, all together with our American and British civilians. They were all captured together at different times during those 2 years. Held together, exactly, thank you. So one of the things we wonder about, John and I have wondered, is it appears that our government was in touch with those countries, and those countries demanded an opportunity to get their citizens out. So one of the things we wonder is if we didn't wait because we knew that the French were negotiating theirs out, the Spanish and such. Because it was interesting that the military operation did not occur until all those countries who planned on negotiating their citizens out was accomplished. It was after all those people were freed that then our government gave the okay to let's try to rescue ours. And all those months when we knew exactly where they were, our hands were tied, if you will. So I think a lot of that has to do with the policy and with our public feeling about our citizens. Do our people want our people home? Is that important to us as Americans, that our government really will have you back and bring you home? Or is it more important that those are things we have to debate as a society, because there's a difference, as Chris said. So thank you for that question.
Okay, go ahead.
Just to add to one point that Diane made at the end there, I think in terms of the political will question, another sort of interesting parallel issue to study would be the issue of whether there are better outcomes when a case is made public or when it's kept private, because one of the things that was certainly a trend that we saw is that the United States government at the time took a very strong position with all of the families that they should keep their cases private, and I don't know that there's actually data that supports that as a position either. And it's another thing that I think is something that we really should get data to support if it's going to be a policy.
And that's another one that I agree it's enormously important, and also for obvious reasons is absolutely not going to be resolved until certain parties decide to make that stuff public. I mean, the sort of open source analysis that we're doing is by definition not going to catch a subset of cases that are not reported.
Tara Maller, with a spokesperson and policy advisor for Counter Extremism Project and a fellow in the security program at New America. You just took part of my question with that response, but I was going to ask, we focused a lot on the policies around hostage release, and we focused a lot on the payments, which is part of policy. And I was going to ask if you see, looking across countries and or even within the US cases itself, a difference in the level of the private versus the public nature of the case, which I understand for obvious reasons. There are compelling reasons to keep some of this private, but that inhibits potentially raising the profile for public support. And I was also going to ask on the second part of that, do you notice, I mean, we're speaking sort of monolithically about countries, but are there differences in the actual, this is a very human thing, so in the people who are actually in touch with the group when they're doing the negotiation or making the decisions, sort of looking at the types of people as a variable in and of itself, whether that's happening through a media organization, whether that's government, whether that's within the government, different agencies, and do you notice differences across countries or domestically based on those variables, public, private, and the actual people, not just ransom payments or U.S. policy?
Okay, yeah, that's a big question. There's a lot of parts of that. When you're
That's a MIT PhD question.
Yeah,
right?
I was going to say you have to remind me of parts of that, because I'm sure I've forgotten half of it already. And I think the answer is generally yes, there are differences. There are lots of different types of differences there. Everything from which countries appear to be better at developing local connections or using intermediaries in a given region to get their people back, how closely they work with local government. whether they go about these negotiations in a way that's, thoughtful, and with regard to how much, havoc they're going to cause locally by paying huge amounts. They differ in terms of their stated policies, even with regard to ransoms. I mean, I think that certain governments are very concerned with the perception that they pay. They're very concerned potentially with the repercussions of their payments, and they try to hide it. Others are sort of more cavalier. But all of this, I have to stress, is stuff that I don't feel that, I wanted to write about this in the paper, but I didn't really feel that I could do that without getting sort of on, direct access to people to discuss it, because I'm making inferences from reading, reams and reams of sort of cases and of journalistic, reports, and occasionally you get something good from WikiLeaks, which has, a bit more meat on the bone. But I wish I could give you something more substantial than that. But
Rachel.
I just wanted to just make a brief point about the media question. And like all areas here, we need evidence, right? And what is right in one case may be completely the wrong thing to do in another. But I just wanted to make a point about the media from a very human perspective. And I can say, from having worked with hundreds of families over 15 years, it is one of the most painful issues for families to deal with. Because in most cases, as a family, you are relatively helpless to bring your loved one home. And it is one of the very few proactive actions you could take as a family. And in many cases, families that we're working with are asking themselves this question every single day. And we are having the conversation with them multiple times a week, multiple weeks a year. Should I be doing it? Because every single night, a family member has to, as their head hits the pillow, they have to ask themselves the same question. And that is, did I do enough today? Did I do everything I could have done today? And I can tell you from experience, right, it is a tortuous question to ask yourself as a family. And our position is not to advise them one way or another. This is a decision that, in our view, as an organization, has to be informed by the negotiation strategy. The answer to the question is, if I go to the media, how am I intending for that to have a positive impact on the negotiation process? But I can tell you from experience, it causes so much pain and so much distress, and is playing on families' minds every single day.
I can't agree enough with that, because I really feel like, I guess one of the things that compelled us as a family to go public was that I knew, I could just tell, people just didn't know. I mean, I think one of the problems here in the United States is that the average person has no idea that hundreds of Americans are taken captive every year. And because of the valid reasons, there are valid reasons, I'm not saying there aren't, but because of a lot of this secrecy, people don't know. So, I mean, it just becomes a non-issue for the average American. Oh, that's unfortunate that one person got taken or whatever. But they don't realize the scope of it. They don't realize how it threatens so many. It threatens humanitarian efforts in the world. It threatens press freedom and democracies in the world. It threatens so much that could create peaceful societies in the world. But this question is difficult, and one of the reasons we went public was because nobody was listening. I mean, nobody, and we were frantic as a family. Please help us, and we knew that early in the search for Jim, that was a time when we really needed the help of journalists and any experts who knew. And so part of our public outcry was, help us, we knew we needed help. And at that time, there was no hostage recovery fusion cell. There was no one whose job it was to even listen to us, really. We were kind of pushed along. Oh, go talk to the FBI. Now, today, talk to the State Department. It was very, very difficult. And yet, in hindsight, I think we did increase Jim's value in the public eye. So it may have worked against our son. I do feel that Jim would have wanted us to do all we could in that regard. But I do think it may have been the wrong thing. Well, I don't know, but because the captors threatened us, they threatened that they would do something to Jim if we're public, and that's when we started to quiet right down. Our government kept advising us, be quiet, don't talk to anybody. But anyway, I have my wonder.
No,
Go ahead, please, Thea.
I think you guys did what you had to do in that situation. But I would just like to say one quick thing, which is that something new has emerged in the world, namely Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS, and the fact that they control this large swath of Syria and Iraq. We don't know how much of those countries, particularly Syria, we don't know how much of Syria, or we underestimate, I think the journalists and everybody else underestimates the degree to which Jabhat al-Nusra controls the places they control and the extent of the geography that they control. This is the factor that is driving the kidnappings. They have so much space within which to work. So I think that it would have been helpful for Diane if we had better understood what it is these people want. We still don't understand that. You know, it's not just cash. I think that a successful negotiation could have freed Jim if we had been better able to measure their psychology. And we cannot do that because we just don't know what these guys are dreaming of at night. We don't know who they are. And they're on Twitter all day, every day. Like, we could examine their tweets. This isn't relevant data for you. We could engage them in conversation. While Aretae was looking for who could we contact to get Theo out, the sheikhs were in the room that I was sitting in, twittering. So I was like, you could have answered their tweets, you know, but they're talking about Ibn Battuta or like Ibn Taymiyyah or whoever it is. So it's hard to negotiate with them. However, a deeper and more powerful understanding of what they want will help us in our negotiations with them and will obviate the need for a military thing, which is just crazy, risky, and not necessary, because they are contactable and they are understandable human beings that have desires, and they can be met and should be met, because we're talking about beautiful, lovely, promising young Americans who don't deserve to live what these people lived through. They didn't do anything wrong, and look what they, look at the treatment that they got. It's not that Jabhat al-Nusra was not mad at me. Like, they basically knew I didn't do anything, but they were mad at the American government. The American government must, at some point, understand that it has a history in these areas, and that those areas are now way on the dark side of the moon. So we need to deeper and better, more powerful understanding of what's happening on the ground, and we ain't got it. My view.
Did he hear?
So thank you again to New America for what you're doing. So my question kind of ties together your question, Denise, Dr. Denise, almost? Diane, D, got it. And what you were saying with regard to monetizing or turning it into a economic model of supply and demand and setting rules and regulations and hoping that maybe Adam Smith could help us through this process. But how do we square that then with the reality that the swath of people who become kidnap victims, whether US or not, a portion we recognize to be truly commercial, to which your market forces may well apply. But then we have what we've all recognized as well, situations like Jim and others, in which it is about unmeetable, undefined, and possibly irrational, sorry Theo, but I think possibly not totally rational, demands that they're asking for. So I like the economic model, but how do we really apply that when the circumstances are well beyond that and it's not about supply and demand of money?
I would maybe challenge the premise that it's not about supply and demand of money. I think most often it is. There are obviously ideological cases, but you have to look sometimes. I mean, in the case of ISIS, my sense is that they're more rational than the common public probably believes, and that at least some of those hostages could have been ransomed, the American and the British ones. I would point to the fact that they were willing to release French hostages for ransom, and they don't have a particularly high opinion of the French, and the French are also involved militarily against ISIS, although I think they didn't begin bombing until after the French hostages were released. I mean, in terms of the market forces stuff, I'm not I'm not either an economist or sort of just an evangelist for capitalism saying it's going to solve all of the problems and we'll do it with market forces, but I think there are sensible things that you can do to prevent ransom values from escalating in the way that they have been over the past 15 years. And there's some really good research and reporting on this from Rukmini Kalamaki talking about how you know, the ransom for a European held by Al-Qaeda has gone from a couple $100,000 to $5, maybe $10 million now. There were really large ransoms paid in the, you know, the 8-figure range for Europeans held by ISIS. And I think there's kind of an information asymmetry that happens there, where I think that a lot of the hostage takers understand the market value of a Western hostage sometimes better than we do. And there are countries that have tried to take a sort of hybrid position. I think Australia is notable for doing this, where they don't have a no concessions policy, but they have a cap for the amount that they will pay, just a flat cap, and over which they will not pay. That might be an example of a sort of, you know, market solution to try to minimize the damage that's done while still recovering your people. And they have, you know, their sample in our data is quite small. I think there's 33 hostages in total. One of those was murdered. So their results seem to be quite good.
So during the trends in piracy, specifically in the Gulf of Aden, really actually give you a subset to study because
oh, sorry,
that was very much the case. The piracy has given you a subset to study in which that's very much the case. So you saw ransoms increase to a point of whatever became the tipping point. And ironically, I believe that probably insurance markets responded to a way that actually applied a market force that drove some controls.
Yeah, and my sense is that that you know, the insurance industry is quite good at doing this. They have a lot of experience doing it. They understand the markets pretty well. It's a different set of cases, oftentimes overwhelmingly criminal, and so there are different ideological forces at work, but I think that it would definitely behoove any government, at least in terms of understanding the dynamics of these situations, you know, to have all this data and to be doing similar kinds of analysis.
I do think that's important, but I really don't think it's all about money. And I really don't. I guess it concerns me when we always are talking about ransom, even though I recognize that's how a lot are resolved. But I guess, to me, as an American, I think the fact that we are not allowed to talk to terrorist captors is a problem. I mean, how can we resolve cases if we cannot interact with people who are holding our citizens? I think that, to me, this ability, because I think that is how we can learn what do they want.
Hold on, Dan, I think we are allowed to talk to them. It's just that when we
Well,
talk,
negotiate. We're not allowed to. In our case, they couldn't even talk. They couldn't. They could not.
They don't know what to say to them.
Well,
it's like, hello, how are you?
I mean, they would advise us what to say, but they weren't allowed to directly email these people. People who spend their life are FBI experts who know how to negotiate. This is their thing. They were not allowed to, because they weren't allowed, at least in our case, and maybe there's, you know, variances, but in our case, they were not allowed to directly interact with the captors. And I know that in the case of Kayla Mueller, the captors for months interacted and wanted to negotiate, wanted to find a way. They wanted to let Kayla go, but that's just, and to me, that was just horrific for them. But I feel that our policy is saying that no, we can't. We can negotiate with criminal captors, but we can't negotiate with terrorist captors. They couldn't do it. So our government was not able to use their expertise to interact and to find out what did they want in the early days when they were willing to consider it. I mean, as the time went on, they became less and less interested and found other ways. They were getting money from other countries, and they were not as interested. But I think there's a time in a captivity where a captor may be interested in talking to, trying to figure out what they can get. But if we can't, and not allowed to interact with them, I feel that's a huge problem. But
I think just two notes on that point. I think this is a place where we heard that anecdotally the Bush administration was a little bit different than the Obama administration, pre-hostage recovery fusion cell at least, in that under the Bush administration it's our understanding that there was a little bit more willingness to interact and to negotiate. In the cases that we saw, not just the Foleys, but others as well, there was a reluctance by the government to either to take over the negotiation directly or to advise the family on what to say. So there was this oddity that the government was saying, don't tell anybody, keep this private, keep it quiet, we'll advise you, we'll help you. And so there were a lot of families that didn't go out and get outside advice. They didn't have a lot of resources other than the government. And then when it came time to negotiate, the government said, sorry, we can't help you negotiate, but you have these conversations if you feel that you're comfortable having the conversations, and we can't pay ransom. You probably shouldn't pay ransom, but maybe we'll look the other way, maybe we won't. And I think it was very confusing.
Very confusing. And I just really feel that we just need more research on this. So we as Americans, we want to make sure that I really feel our country wants to. I mean, our country people kept telling me that Jim was the highest priority. I think in one's head and heart as Americans, we like to feel that. But our policy and the way it's administered in different departments and everything, that wasn't the case. They weren't allowed to do what they could have done in terms of using our expertise to bring our son home anyway.
Can I say one word about financial motive for the kidnappings? I mean, I think that in my case, and I just think generally speaking, the danger to us is the young men who are wandering around on the street who have grievances against the U.S. and they want to surrender us to the appropriate local authorities. Our problem is with the appropriate local authority. As soon as I was caught, like within 24 hours, I was in front of a judge. I could just plead my case. But this was an Islamic court, and it was the terms of my trial were not necessarily according to the modern standards of criminal justice in this country, in any case. So I don't think that I'm certain that those people who got me did not have a financial motive. They were, and that the problem cannot be addressed by somehow coming to lowering their ransom thing and diminishing their hopes of a financial reward because they have so much emotional desire to come after us. And we got to understand this emotional desire. The more we understand the emotional desire, the better we will be able to negotiate with these people once we understand what's going on in their heads. But I don't even think the best of our officials, they had no clue as to how to talk to them. That's why when the Kayla Mueller thing started going on, they were so frightened. They were just like, get me away from this. We don't know what to do. We don't know how to talk to these people.
So in your case, if I could ask, I mean, do you think that Qatar knew how to talk to them? Do you think that's what did it?
Qatar is great. Very good. I love those people. They're very good talkers. Yes. I think they have.
We're beginning to run out of time, so what we're going to do is we're just going to take 3 or 4 questions together and answer them, and then that'll be that. So Teddy, with Albert, and do you have a question? And this gentleman's been very patient, and the guy in back.
Hi, Albert Ford. I work with Peter and Chris here at New America's International Security Program. I'm curious about successful instances, Aretae, Chris, Rachel, where international cooperation between aid organizations based in different countries who have different people who are held hostage in different countries, and then foreign governments. We've looked at the case of Pierre Corky and Luke Summers in Yemen in 2014, and in a 2-hour time span, the South African aid organization had negotiated a $200,000 release for Pierre, and then in 2 hours, a U.S. Special Operations raid ended up resulting in the death of both Luke, Pierre, and 8 other civilians. So, Chris, you talked about this, but I'm curious to know if any of you have dealt with circumstances where successful cooperation or integration between multiple aid agencies in foreign countries or multiple foreign governments have yielded a successful outcome, or if any of the 3 of you have by yourselves thought of any solutions where those kinds of interactions, cooperations among foreign entities, to Chris's point that this is an international problem that can't be solved with one country's independent solution. I'm just curious if either of the 3 could comment on that.
Okay, and this lady here. Teddy, this lady here.
Hi, I'm a freelance reporter living in Kabul, and I our house moved last fall because there were 2.5 kidnappings on our street alone. And since then, we had another friend who was kidnapped. And the thing that really stunned me was tasks that I thought should go to men and women in suits and uniforms fell on the shoulders of 3 20-year-olds who didn't, sorry, I'm not 20 years old, people in their 20s. And yeah, and that really truly stunned me. And the thing that we kept asking was we didn't even know what would be a reasonable ask to various government agencies and also the employers of the people, my friend who had been kidnapped. And I was just wondering if there were some consensus that are being built now on what the ask should be.
Thank you. I'm a Canadian, and Canada has a policy like the US and Britain of no concessions. And two related questions. One, do you believe that the captors actually believe that these countries do not make concessions? Because they certainly seem to carry on long after they've been reminded these countries don't make concessions. And related question, I think Diane Foley touched on it. I have trouble thinking of any other circumstances where if somebody has something I want, I'm going to go out of my way to tell them I won't talk to you. So is it even a good idea to have this policy, much less to keep restating it so boldly, so blankly, without any nuance?
Yeah, to your first question, quickly, I mean, Canada is another country that has a stated no concessions policy. Recently, there were 2 Canadians who were beheaded by Abu Sayyaf in the Philippines after they were not ransomed. I don't know whether that signals a tighter adherence to that policy by Canada than they had been pursuing prior, or whether that is to do with the new regime in the Philippines and the way they're treating Abu Sayyaf and they're interacting with Western governments who have hostages held there. But certainly I've seen a lot of reporting identifying ransom payments made by Canada in the period that we have studied. I think notably Robert Fowler, who is a diplomat in North Africa, who was ransomed. So that, in case you were probably wondering, is why we didn't include Canada in the group, the no concession group.
Well, to clarify, they have a stated no concession policy, but they do make concessions.
Yes,
yeah.
yes. And I'm saying that recently we may be hitting an inflection point where that is changing, but I can't,
So the other questions?
Yeah, I mean, I'll come in on 2 of them, and then there was a final point I wanted to make if you'll entertain that. On the international cooperation point, I mean, actually my family's case is a great example of that. My British uncle was taken with a German, a Dane, and a Colombian. And there were certainly complications in the case in that they weren't all working for the same company, and there were sort of, obviously a number of different governments involved, but they ended up with one crisis response company responding on behalf of all 4 men, and they all came out safely. So I think that kind of cooperation is, I see it certainly in the private sector. I'm sure it happens at a government level. I mean, we as an organisation don't get involved in the same way in seeing stuff that's happening behind the scenes with government. So I'm not sort of qualified to answer that question from the perspective of government-led cases, but I've certainly seen it firsthand in the case of my own family, and it can definitely work. I thought the question about the reasonable ask was really, really important, and it's part of the reason that we exist as an organisation, because for almost every single family or friend or neighbour going through this is the first time you've been through it, and it's almost certainly going to be the last time you go through it. And your learning curve is very, very steep. Well, we've been through it a million times, either first-hand or second-hand. And, knowing what it's okay to ask for. I mean, I've worked with families who, for 18 months, haven't put anything in writing to the government because, not necessarily this government, by the way, but because they thought it might seem a bit aggressive. I mean, listen, you don't get anything done unless you put it in writing with governments. There's a language that you need to learn to speak. There's a bunch of acronyms that you have to come to terms with very quickly. You don't know whether it's okay to ask for assistance to pay your psychological counselling bill, or whether you should be saving the stubs from your flights to DC, because will we be able to claim it back later, let alone the most important stuff, which is how the hell does this get solved, and how do we solve it as quickly as possible? So I think you're absolutely asking the right question there, is most families going through this do not know what it's reasonable to ask. And so I'm just pleased that in our own small way we can at least give them the list of questions that it is okay to ask, so that they can find their way through it. And I just wanted to just say one last thing, which is that we've talked today over and over again, all of us, complete consensus on the need for data, research, analysis, scrutiny. And my plea as an activist working in this area is, let's do something about it. You know, why are we not, let's just go home and start sharing data. And I will certainly commit that we as an organisation will make sure that every single family that we work with, every single returned hostage that we support through Surviving Survival, will know that this data set exists, and that is an option for them to add themselves to this data set. And I think the ask back to government and to risk consultancies is, give us your data. And I think, you know, it can be done in an anonymised way. It can be done in a way that does not compromise national security, and doing it could save lives. So please, let's just do it, as Nike would say. Let's just do it.
And I'd just like to add that I really feel international cooperation is vital. That, as Rachel said, often in the private sector and with the hostages who were working with Doctors Without Borders. I mean, a lot of times different countries have found ways to work together to get their people out. I've also seen a situation like the French nonprofit Acted, who had Federico Motka, an Italian, and David Haynes, a British, both working for them, taken hostage. And in that case, the governments interfered because the Italians, you know, felt good about their ability to get Federico out, but the British did not. So it was, to me, that's the hope, is I think we do, particularly when they're all Western, our Western allies, when people are taken together, we need to find out together, how can we help get our people home? And I often think the answer is that collaboration.
Yeah.
Whatever we do with all this data we're going to generate, if we don't turn it into a political will or change in feeling around the country, we're not going to make, I mean, nothing's going to change. So this isn't all about finding the right person within the government. It isn't all about finding the right organization to go get our son or daughter. It's about, I think, changing will. I'm so struck by the fact that we are so different from our European allies, and without any real change in will, I mean, I'm not really hopeful that we're going to make a whole lot of change.
Well, I'm hopeful that getting evidence that shows that our citizens are being captured all the time, and we are suffering very bad outcomes. Is this what the Americans want? Do Americans not care? I mean, I think some of it is people needing to know, our citizens, and that's why I think this research is hugely helpful in terms of informing and bringing the evidence to bear.
But Diane, just so we leave on a slightly more positive note, perhaps, how would you characterize, obviously in 2015, the Obama administration made a lot of changes. And how would you characterize those changes and how effective they've been?
I feel it's been a sea change, Peter.
Right.
When Jim was in captivity, it was no one's job to bring him home. Absolutely no one's. It was on everybody's list, mind you. They meant well. but it was no one's job. Now we have this interagency group that brings the best of our intelligence, State Department, FBI, to the table together. And they are listening to families. To me, it's a sea change. However, I feel that our policy constrains what some of them are able to do. They still, we still need to let our experts do their job. And without the will, as you said, John, without, as a country, us wanting this for our citizens, and without us having policy changes that are more amenable to, I love what you said about, when did you hear that someone has something you want and you are not allowed to talk to them about it? I mean, how are we going to be able to get our citizens home without a way to interact and use our expertise? So I feel it's a huge change. Good things are happening, and that's why I'm grateful for this research, to continue this momentum so we can free our young men, so Austin Tice can come home, and these other incredibly wonderful Americans doing very valuable work in the world. I'm feeling more hopeful. Thank you.
Thank you to our brilliant panel.
Thank you.